Now I'll introduce committee member Jim Rondinelli and newly re-elected committee member who produced this meeting to introduce Adam Dorn. Jim?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the kind introduction. I'm delighted tonight to have one of the best people in music and the world of film and video with us today. Adam Dorn's credits are almost too numerous to mention, but I'm going to try to give it a shot. Uh, Adam Dorn is a consummate musician, a musician's musician. And just to put this in perspective, this is a guy that people like Marcus Miller and Sting hired to be their bass player. Uh, Graduate of the Berklee School of Music, Adam is the son of noted Atlantic Jazz staff producer Joel Dorn, whose work we'll be also talking about a little bit in the context of today's talk. But it's not just about Adam's work as a musician, because Adam is an extraordinarily talented composer and producer, engineer as well, a veteran of Right Track Studios in New York in the early days, as well as a bunch of other facilities. Adam has advanced his career past production and engineering into synchronization work, film and soundtrack work, and for particularly well-known stuff. Adam's music has appeared in movies like The Devil Wears Prada, The Bourne Supremacy, and on TV shows like CSI, 6 Feet Under, Better Call Saul, and a number of other television shows and documentaries like the Richard Pryor documentary, which was stellar. But Adam also has another side. Adam records under the moniker Motion Worker. His latest album, Boombox, came out last year and is a great listen. And his next feature film, Gunner with Morgan Freeman, arrives this fall. So please, without further ado, let me introduce the one and only Adam Dorn.
All right, man. How are you?
It's great, man.
Let's dig in. We'll just treat this like one of our phone conversations.
I think that's the right approach. Or somewhere between this and Adam produces a wonderful podcast that I recommend for all of you called The Compared to What Podcast, or whatever name he chooses to change it to as whims permit. Adam, you've had a tremendous career. How did you end up at playing bass for Marcus Miller?
It's not a short story, but it really all started with me actually just writing him a letter in 1985. I was a young bass player. I heard Marcus is playing. A really good friend of mine who's an incredible producer and programmer, a guy named Stephen Wolf, lived in my neighborhood. I was just a teenager and I wanted to be a drummer. And he said, "Don't be a drummer. I'm a drummer. If you're a drummer, we'll never work together." So he played me a David Sanborn record called Straight to the Heart. I heard Marcus play that bass solo on Run for Cover, and it was over. I became a bass player. And actually, I as a kid, I mean, I grew up in this business. My father, was a record producer for 40 years. The bulk of his work was at Atlantic. And I just thought, like, well, Marcus works with Luther Vandross. I know Luther Vandross's management company. I wrote a letter thinking that the management company would just pass it along to Marcus at a session. And they did. They actually did. Someone passed it along. And about 6-7 months later, Marcus Miller calls me and was like, "I want to hear you play. I really loved your letter." Now, the thing that cracks me up is that I was 16 and he was 27. Like we were both babies at this time. He was just a baby with a bunch of platinum records under his belt. But I left high school. I moved to New York City. I was actually playing on sessions already, but I really wanted to meet Marcus. In this amount of time, I learned how to play bass enough that I actually started playing on things. Like within 8 months of picking up the bass, I was doing sessions. So I meet Marcus. It was 1987. So I would have been 16 at this point because some time passed. And we've been friends and colleagues and working together like ever since. Like I basically was brought into the studio to be basically his protege. And that turned into what is now a 37-year relationship. And we write together. We insult each other via text on regular basis. We've been friends forever. And like, you know, I was in his band. I toured with him. I played bass and keyboards. I guess I played bass with Marcus because I showed at a very young age that I was a very competent bass player. And of everyone in my sub-generation from him, we've just connected. I really play that similar style. And even though he endlessly treats me like Don Rickles and insults my playing, I persist. And we're just buds. And we've been working together off and on forever. I've worked on 3 of his albums. He's worked on 2 of mine. I toured with him for about 2-3 months, you know, in Asia, you know, in the band. And it's a cornerstone of who and what I am as a musician, because, and I don't know, you know, who here knows who Marcus is. Just for a little background, Marcus is one of the best bass players in the world. And he was Miles Davis's producer, Luther Vandross's producer and collaborator and co-creator, Wayne Shorter, Roberta Flack, David Sanborn, who we sadly just lost, Joe Sample, you know, Shaka Khan. Like, he played or produced or wrote songs for almost every R&B and jazz artist in the 80s and 90s, and started at the age, if you know the Grover Washington song, Just the Two of Us, that's him playing bass at 19 years old. And on that session, Richard T., the famous organ player, didn't like that he was playing too much, and he threw him up against the wall and said, "Stop playing all the fills," which I'd love to remind him about, because I met Richard when I was 5, and I was afraid of Richard at 5, and Marcus got thrown up against the wall. So anyway, long story short, Marcus is a, you know, a lot of my career comes through Marcus's filter. He's a film composer. He's a band leader. He's a recording artist. He's a songwriter, a producer. He set the path for me. And I don't do things similarly to him, but I definitely use that as my roadmap, you know, to not just do a thing, or you know, music is to be explored in as many angles and directions as possible. So I couldn't ask for a better musical mentor. I have 2 other mentors in my father and Hal Willner, but Marcus is my nuts and bolts music, you know, how to comport yourself professionally as a musician. I went to Marcus Miller High School and university.
You know, it's funny because I was going to ask you, to name off some of perhaps the better known musicians Marcus has worked with, but instead of that, let me ask you about the role that both Hal and your dad played in your life and in launching your career, because you've got this career that's kind of spanned everything, right? You've been a player, you've been a producer, you've been an engineer, you've worked with artists like Kesha. You have a fundamentally different approach to art, to creating music, as Mo, from everything else that you've done in your life. And as long as we've known each other, I've been trying to piece together, where the hell did this guy come from? And I get little bits of it, but there's no longitudinal thing. So let's talk about the end caps of the great Hal Willner, who, for those of you who don't know, was the musical director of Saturday Night Live through most of his life. And the quintessential downtown New York producer, who had a gift for deciding that 2 seemingly disparate musicians would be able to do something special together, and pulled it off.
Right. Leonard Cohen and Sonny Rollins.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
That's Hal in a nutshell. So really short but fun story. Hal was mentored by my father in the neighborhood that we lived in outside of Philadelphia. It's called the Main Line. Hal's father, an Auschwitz survivor, owned a deli, and Hal at 15 was a busboy in a delicatessen, you know, in suburban Philadelphia. My father went in as a customer one night, and Hal was like, "This is not like the regular customers here. This guy does something. I don't know what it is, but my father had a big beard, and he just looked like he was in music or around something."
Well, he was
So
Joel was a player.
yeah,
Joel
I mean,
was like a player.
yeah, but my father was Hal was obsessed with the artists that my father produced, and he knew that he kind of lived in the neighborhood. But one night he came into the restaurant, and Hal, in his full busboy uniform, walks up to the table and goes, "Are you Joel Dorn?" And my father was like looking at this, awkward 15-year-old, and he's like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Do you produce Rahsaan Roland Kirk and Les McCann and Eddie Harris and Roberta Flack?" And my father was like, "Who are you?" And they just Hal said, "I'm the biggest Rahsaan Roland Kirk fan you'll ever meet." And my father was like, "Where do you live? Come to my house. I have vinyl for you." And they just started up a friendship. Hal then goes to NYU, and one of his courses is at NYU is being my father's assistant, which my father always wrote a very detailed report card for him, which is very funny if my father was not that guy. But so it's generational in so much as my father set up Hal, taught him the ropes of the record business. Marcus really set me up in terms of musicianship, and my father wasn't working in studios at the time, so my making a connection with Marcus at that young age set me up to be really around vibrant, current, very in the moment recording techniques of that late 80s, early 90s era. Hal comes into my life a few years later. He unfortunately, for a little while, had some substance abuse issues. When he cleaned up, he saw that I was doing a certain kind of production, and we connected. And then we connected and worked with, we must have done about 30, 35, films and albums. Everyone from Bill Frisell to Laurie Anderson, Lou Reed, John Cale, Leonard Cohen, U2. We did a film, a Wim Wenders film with Brian Eno, Daniel Lanois, Bill Frisell, myself, and Hal scoring the film. So, the sidemen, where Brian Blade was just a side, he wasn't, "You're not a composer, you're just a drummer, Brian." Yeah. Hal opened my entire world to the art rock scene and the performance art world, while Marcus really introduced me to the real jazz and R&B world. That's why I think I inhabit a bunch of spaces. I get to Miles Davis through Marcus, but I get to Sting and Bono and Professor Irwin Corey through Hal, like this random, all over the map. So it's a very balanced but eclectic body of work as a result of these two guys being key players in my early under 30. I did just hundreds of hours of sessions with both of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is some heavy company, man.
Yeah. It was
heavy
great.
Company, heavy experiences. And these were also, regrettably, the kind of experiences that could happen in New York now. Can they still happen in New York today?
Not that I know of. I mean, they happen in different ways. There's still a studio scene, but Avatar happily becomes Power Station again, but it's owned by Berklee School of Music. Electric Lady is owned by a private equity, like Wall Street investor. These are not really open spaces to people anymore. So, I mean, I've worked at Power Station a little bit since Berklee purchased it, and they're doing cool stuff, but it's not the same thing. It is, because you don't have the same ecosystem. You don't have the same studio musician scene. You don't have the same, producer and engineer scene. I mean, Jim, when we were running through you and I were at all of the, Axis and Right Track and Quad and, Hit Factory and Sony and Sound. Yeah, media. There was an entire economy there was a world of studios. It's now whittled down to a handful. And there's some cool places, but there isn't the same sort of community to service them and to inhabit them. So it really was, it's funny, I was a very active studio musician for about 5 years before I decided to kind of stop doing that work. And it was amazing to just float in and out of jingle studios and recording studios at a young age, like sort of similar to Marcus, like being like very much the younger person on the gig. And, you know, I caught a real taste of what that really was in the 70s and 80s. I caught the tail end, and I really wish that there could be a scenario where young musicians and young engineers and producers could have this emulated again, because it was priceless. It almost felt like, for anyone that's like older and might know this reference, it felt like Sid Caesar's Show of Shows. It was, you were on the seat of your pants. It was live. It was, you know, and I worked on SNL for 4 seasons. So I got a taste of working on live television, not to make that literal connection to Sid Caesar, but it was like, you would just get called for something, show up at a studio, and in 3 hours, a record was made. You know, like, and then you go do a jingle, you know, like this was it really existed in a specific way. It's just different now. We're all siloed in our own rooms now, you know, that sense of community. There's a lot of people still making wonderful stuff, but now, you know, sometimes I wish I didn't know how to play as many instruments as I do, and that I couldn't do all the stuff I need to do on a film score, because I love community and I love working with others, and, you know, having an engineer that changes the course of a session because they bring up, you know, hey, that's out of tune, or you're not paying it. You know what I mean? Like, you know, they're working with the Joe Furlas or the, you know, they're Elliot Shiners, where, you know, it's like, hey, you're not the producer, but you just bailed the producer's ass out. You know what I mean? Like there was that, you know, the Gene Pauls of the world that would like make sure sessions stayed on track while you know, the lunatics ran the asylum. I miss those days. They were really magical.
It was a really charmed time, but it's really funny because you've still managed in your records, and I think this is a great time to perhaps play a Mowo record to frame it up a little bit.
Right.
And this will segue a little bit into talking about some of your dad's work as well.
Okay.
You've managed to, as a solo artist, make something that sounds like, the first time I heard this particular record we're about to play, it just blew my mind. I couldn't imagine the mind that it came from, and how all this stuff stitched together, and how there was such a live feel from this. So
What are you
without
going to play? What are you going to play? I'd like to set things up.
Yeah, please. I like it. I was thinking this is where we'd start with. Well, I should ask so you can set this up properly. Where would you like to go? Because you know that I was pulling stuff from the videos. I was thinking we might start with Shake It Boogie.
That's a good idea.
And then go to My Own Little World.
That sounds great. So just what you're about to see is an animator in Poland made a video for me. He was a fan of my records. I decided when I started writing music for myself, I'm in love with all things jazz. And I wanted to figure out a way to make what was going on in electronic music at the time merge with the 30s and 40s big band sound. And what you're about to hear is as much played by musicians as it is sampled, but I take a pointillism approach to sampling. So everything you hear is a note here, a note there, a note here, a note there from records, and I've replayed everything. It's kind of like a Chuck Close or a Jackson Pollock, you know, if they, you know, if you combine like the chaos of Jackson Pollock with the precision of Chuck Close. So it sounds like a 30s record, but it was never played. Everything about it is like, it's a puzzle. It's, if you could see the Pro Tools session for it, it's not just little MIDI dots. It's like minuscule, and it sounds like it's an actual big band. The idea was to make samples and to make all of this technology feel like it has a soul and it's from another era. but I hate sampling. I hate the Puff Daddy, like here's 4 bars of a song everyone knows and it's already a hit. I take the 100% opposite approach. It's like, here's a song you've never heard before, but it sounds like it's from an era and legit to that era. So that's Shake Your Boogie.
Great. So let's roll it.
All right. And it's cute. One more time.
Oh, that is so happening, man.
It's 21 years old too, which is so wild to me. Like it's aged pretty well.
It sure has, right? Because you didn't do any of the stuff that time stamped it to the era in which you created it.
Exactly.
So these are all, there's no RMX 16 or whatever on it.
No.
So going back to the process of your capturing, so you're quite literally sampling notes and then reperform it, all the notes. How deep are you going into like expression, pitch, mod wheel, all of that stuff, or is it mostly, do you pull that stuff off from the players?
So I use a piece of software, and it's funny. I at the time that I made this record, I was using like version 3 of what's called Reason, and it enables me to take quarter notes from like a 5-minute record. So I put them across an 88 key keyboard, and I have ba bum bing bum bing ba. So I have all these micro samples from, you know, in this instance, let's just say it might be a Cab Calloway song, it might be a Duke Ellington's. I don't know. I can't remember. I actually can't remember, but it's all taking these things. And then my buddy Steve Bernstein from Sex Mob, a Hal Willner connection, he played some trumpet, but then I did the same thing to his trumpet solo. I took that and took it note by note, and I play it, because the whole idea is, and also to harken back to your, it doesn't have a timestamp. I remember at the time when the record came out, someone said to me like, oh man, you know, you're using like that kick drum or whatever. And I was just like, there is nothing on this record that is from this moment, and everything is already dated. So if you're going to tell me my record sound dated, if the record was already 70 years old when I was like, you know, I'm like, give me a break. So I love it. I'm like, my whole thing is I'm dated at all times. So you can't, you can't insult me with calling me dated. But yeah, these songs, and I made a bunch of tracks like this after making some really aggressive music in the styles called drum and bass music. I found this thing, like I stumbled across, this big band thing and this more jazz kind of thing. And that song in particular was used in CSI. It was used for a Crayola commercial, a Hilton commercial. Like it was in I think a movie with, what's that actor? It was called The Animal, Rob Schneider, like the crazy, like that dude. It was licensed like 15 times. So I just loved that you could make a track like this, right? And there is a world for it to be used in TV and film. Like it was used in documentaries, it was used in films and TV shows, and just making this kind of instrumental music, even though my vocals at the end are kind of fun, it's mostly instrumental music. It started bringing this attention from music supervisors and editors. Film editors started pitching my music to directors they were working with and putting stuff I was working on in temp scores. And then that led to people calling me to make them no longer be temp scores, to move into the composer thing. And that was a real big surprise because I thought I was just making fun, catchy music. And it turned into an entire other career in a way. So it's kind of fun.
But it's a pretty iconic thing, man. I mean, that track again is timeless. It's got meaning in all of these, and this is kind of the wild thing about it, right? You've created a piece of art that has become a component of other pieces of art that everybody then connects to the point in time when they saw that film or that movie, or when they saw The Devil Wears Prada, or when they heard it on CSI or something like that. And then every time that stuff comes out, it brings immediacy to them as well. It kind of timestamps back to timestamps that time in their life, like the song of the summer.
Well, what was interesting is that particular track and another one called what was the other one? Shake Your Boogie and not Sis Boom Ba. I forget all my tune. I have the worst memory for even my own tune titles.
I'm even worse with your song titles than I am with lyrics, so don't worry about that.
Yeah, they're strange. But long story short, that was used in a Nintendo device shipped with that song as a demo thing. So I still hear from people that are now like 28, 29 years old that when they were like 6 years old, that song was like, that was the theme to my song. And it's just, I love it. It's just like awesome. It's like a little memory for people that were playing a video game. Like it's great.
But then this opens up the music supervisor community to you, and it leads you to a very different place, because once you start getting in temp tracks, and for those of you who aren't familiar with this concept, when you're playing together a movie, you have a track called the temp track, where the music supervisor might find a piece of music for the scene, and they may try 5 or 6 different things in there. They may decide that they don't want you in it at the last minute because they have the chance to put a Celine Dion track in or something. But when you have something that's really unique and it gets put in a temp track and it fits the scene, it's really unlikely to get displaced. So that leads you to this whole other world of your career. And by the way, a quick pause.
Sure.
You talked about Propeller Head Reason, and I know that that's been your jam for a long time. What else is in your rig at home these days? What are you using to create this stuff? What are sort of the key elements of your rig?
So for film and TV and documentary work, it's always Pro Tools. I do all film composition, all recording, all editing, all mixing is done in Pro Tools, mostly because the folks at Reason Studios did something really cool. I think they saw that they were never going to be a player in the DAW world. So they made every aspect of their DAW available as a plugin in anything else that supported audio units or VST or AAX. So, truthfully, for like a full, like an action film or or a documentary, I'm not leaning on reason at all. But I'm trying to think. I have probably every DAW on my rig, but I really lean mostly on Reason and Pro Tools. Sometimes I mess around with Ableton and Logic because I think they each offer different workflow and different inspiration to create different types of things. Most of the time, I'm not in the other ones too long. If I come up with an idea, I'll export and and bring it into Pro Tools. I just find that Pro Tools, in terms of audio management and editing, and really being, it's funny, I know there's a piece of software called Logic. Pro Tools is logical. Pro Tools actually, for coming from a background of working consoles and actual like audio, I just find it's the easiest of all of them to like really start something and end up on a mix stage, and you're in Avid the whole time. You're never leaving that environment. Like it's kind of perfect at this point. When I send my score, finished score stuff, I basically, because the machines are so powerful now and can play back so many voices, I'm generally on a mix stage where I just like commit whatever my film score is to audio and send the entire master session. Like, it's kind of big, but they run it on a satellite rig locked into their, and it's all Avid. It just stays in that, ecosystem, or whatever the term would be.
And that makes perfect sense too, especially when you know that they're going to have it on the stage and everybody kind of knows what it is, and there are no translation problems.
No.
So music supervisors start dropping your stuff into temp scores. You start getting other calls for sync. At some point, that brings you back towards the composer world as well, where you're now starting to compose soundtracks proper. So tell us a little bit about that journey.
Well, unfortunately, private equity kind of messed up giant segments of our business. Sync vanished, right? Sync just went away. What was Sync from 2000 to 2010 does not exist at all the same way anymore. There are so many major players, purchasing catalogs, buying the rights to, huge libraries of music. It's just so difficult for artists to get synced now. It used to be, there was a Wild West period between like 98 and 2010. I was doing like 3-4 real syncs a month. And then just honestly, after the financial crisis of 2008, something changed. It really got weird, and it's never really gone back. So luckily, I had developed a bunch of relationships with music supervisors at a variety of, they're not at networks, but they're at, generally music supervisors have, in order to make a living, need to have like 6 to 7 shows going. They have to manage a lot of stuff. So I was lucky through releasing these Motion Worker records, between 99 and 2005, 2006. I did enough sync licensing that I was getting calls from, actually mostly from in LA, the radio station KCRW featured some of the biggest, music supervisors: Thomas Golubich, Nick Harcourt, Liza Richardson, who's still a huge music supervisor, and Lit. I built relationships with them as an artist, and in turn, I'm getting car commercials and film placements and all this. One thing that was really weird is it wasn't a smooth transition at all, because when you're an artist and someone's licensing music from you and it's working in films, that step into actually being a composer, instead of just like a band that made a song that worked in a film, for example, there's a lot of, you haven't done this, who are you? Just because you had music in Devil Wears Prada doesn't mean you know how to score a film. I had to really, really, like, I'm trying to say, like, tap dance my way into the hearts of some music supervisors to gain their trust. So the real process was doing a lot of free work and auditioning for things, until finally I started getting some traction around 2012, 2013. I worked on a couple successful things and it opened up some doors. But I do refer to the film score world. It's not feast or famine. It's snack or famine. It is like you know what I mean? It is a tough world. I found which is very atypical, a couple of lanes in simultaneously. And I've just worked those for the last 10, 12 years. I do a lot of work for Disney. I do a lot of work on these action films, these like indie, hyper violent action films. I'm a pacifist and I write 100 minutes of the most violent music. And I'm trying to think of the third lane is I've gotten really lucky in documentaries. I've had a couple of really heavy directors, like Alex Gibney is an Oscar-winning director. He was a Motion Worker fan, and he licensed a bunch of music from me, and he gave me, without any BS, he's like, I got something. Do you think you can score this? And I did it, and I hit it out of the park, and we've done a bunch of work together, you know. I did a Robin Williams HBO documentary for Alex and a director named
a stunner.
It's a beautiful film. Beautiful. Film. So, you know, and that's led to a couple of series and a couple more feature films. But it's a tough hustle. Film composing is really tough.
You talked in one of your recent podcasts about how there are certain lanes, even though you're an established soundtrack producer. And I love the way you laid this out, how there are certain gigs that aren't accessible to you. Could you kind of walk us through that? Because I think that might give, you know, or certain titles or certain production levels of production that you still don't feel are accessible to you. If Spielberg's doing a new movie, does he call Mowo?
No, and I think so. There's a couple different areas of the composing world, and I'll keep this brief because I want to talk more about gear and, you know, records. But it is a siloed world, like in the video game world. You know, it's funny, similar to just the American experience in the last 20 years. 4 or 5 people generally kind of just get everything in almost every industry. There are mockers, you know, there are people that kind of run stuff. So you have in film composition, you know, I'm up against, as a composer, Hans Zimmer has a number of buildings in Santa Monica filled with about 40 different composers that can collectively write all of the music for whatever dozen things that are going on at a time. So when you go at this alone, you're just, you know, you're really kind of rollerblading up a mountain covered with Vaseline. Like it is, you're going up against guys that have teams of 10, 12, you know, helpers. I know some TV composers that at any given time, they have like 8 or 9 shows at once, and they have about 8 or 10, you know, people on salary. That's very hard to go up against. It wasn't the case 15, 20 years ago. That's a model, I think, that Hans built. And I have nothing against it. It just makes jumping into this much harder.
Yeah, it does make me wonder where the transition, and pardon the liberal use of Yiddish, but where is the line between Mocker and Altacocker?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I'd be fine. No, I really don't know. It's difficult, you know. And the thing is, having done, like, if I was to go back to my 17-year-old self, right, having done the studio musician run and the touring musician run and the record producer and songwriter and, you know, recording artist, all of these things, you take lessons from each thing that you find yourself in. I have found, you know, and I was really lucky at the age of 17 to be around Miles Davis and like actually sit and eat dinner with him and hear literally life lessons. Like, you know, people talk about a guy like Miles and they say, oh, he's mercurial or whatever. He was a mentor and loved young musicians and was a really, if he liked you, he was a very, very warm, you know, giving person. And I remember he basically was like, and I'm not going to do the impersonation of him, but he's like, look at my career. Every 5 years, my career changes. If you're going to do this, every 5 years, your career will change. And when you're 17 and you have someone say that to you, it seems abstract, and you're headstrong, and I'm going to just be a bass player. Well, no, you're not, because there's going to be no studio work in 10 years. Like, that's going to dry up. So everything is music. It's just, how do you find yourself fitting in to what music is? Like right now, everybody, the buzzwords are AI, and everybody's worried about so many things. I'm fine. I just do what I do. And it's like a boat on rough seas. You just you write yourself and you just figure it out. Like, I can't worry about AI. AI to me is like, just cracks me up. Like, people send me tracks and they're like, hey, I made a weather report track. And I'm like, I'm great. That sounds horrible. It's like, it's so in its weird infancy stages that it's like, whatever, like,
that's really actually it's good to hear you talk about that, and it's refreshing perspective, because at the end of the day, AI is only trained on our tracks anyway, right? So
you tell me, in 1982, the drummers that figured out how to move forward when drum machines came in, those are the guys that got my respect. They didn't give up. They were just like, drum machine's not going to replace me. I'm much better, I'm much better than this piece of equipment. I'll play with it. I'll learn how to program it better than, the keyboard player that's sitting there with his R8, it's just adapting. You always have to adapt everything. You had to adapt in 1910. You know what I mean? Like, you were riding in a horse and buggy, and a Model T was coming by. You know what I mean? Like, it's always adapting to technology and using it to your advantage.
So using that as a jumping off point back into the gear.
Yes.
How much of your time are you recording? I know recently you did a bunch of live shows with my dear pal and our Philly brethren, Steve Berlin.
Yeah.
And it was a realization of a soundtrack that you had recorded together. How much stuff are you doing now, recording in the house? When are you using outside facilities? What does your workflow look like these days?
So my workflow is going to be very funny to folks here, because I have always come from the less is more angle of things. I've worked on literally like major Disney things and major just like network things, like effectively in a closet. Like, I had a studio in my house in South Pasadena when we lived in South Pasadena. And people really like, I want to come and see your studio. And I'm like, you're going to be really disappointed. There's a bass laying on a sofa. There's 2 monitors, a pair of Genelecs, and an audio interface. That's my studio. Like, I don't come at this with, and like, I have the mic that I want to record if a horn player comes over. Like, I learn my room wherever I have my gear. I learn my room, like, how they say, everyone's like, oh, do you get it treated? I don't treat anything. I just learn how bad my room is and how to compensate for it. So my workflow and my gear thing, it's all in the box. I've always been in the box. I have a billion plugins. I know what they do. I know how I want to use them. And I know this sounds boring, but it's like, I'm not like, I have friends that are like, you want to see my mic closet? And I'm like, do you want to see my coat closet? Like, I have coats. I actually have coats in my closet. It's like, I got 2 basses. It's funny. Like, I have friends that like went nuts and they had a little success and they bought all this gear. And I'm like Marcus bought a Euphonics console, and I walked into his studio and I'm like,
oh God.
I was like, Marcus, you bought a mouse. You bought $100,000 mouse or whatever. And he just started laughing. I was like, you wanted the pretty thing with the lights. I was like, you can do this all in the computer. You're fine. You know how all this is supposed to sound. So I don't know. I'm boring on the gear front. I'm sorry, everyone.
But that's good, because when you listen to your stuff, man, it's not like, oh, I can tell dude was in the box.
No.
I had an array of half a dozen Fairchilds that I use, for different things, and I only send the Ellington tracks through this one
Oh
because
yeah.
it came from Universal. I would have believed
I'm
it.
gonna tell you something funny. So anyone here, you Jim, you know Charlie Hunter, right? The
Of
musician.
course.
So Charlie Hunter and I are best friends. And we were doing a session at a studio in Glendale in California. And we're such good friends. We made a record together just for the two of us, never to release it. We just wanted to make a record because there's so many inside jokes and whatever. We made this record, and we were at the Sky Studio, and you made me think of this story by saying I have 11 Fairchilds. And it was like the episode of Seinfeld when he has the contractor doing his kitchen, and he's like, how do you want the cabinets? Do you want them rounded? What do you want the pulls to be like? And we're just like, hit record. I don't care how anything is made. He was telling us all these gain structures, and this amp is going to go this figure, and then I have an LA2A here and a C12. And I was just like, go into record. He's playing something good. I don't care how we're getting there. It doesn't matter to me. I've been doing this for 35. If I want someone to explain it to me, Gene Paul explained microphones to me when I was 9. I don't need someone, you know what I mean? I'm just like, ah. So it just always cracks me up when someone tells me like all the signal. I'm like, plug my bass in. The sound is in my hands. If you put a nice, DI in the, thank you. I don't need to know. Like, I just want to get the idea captured. I don't care how it gets captured.
No, but that's perfect, because you've also had the luxury of working with some of the greatest musicians in the world, right? Where the sound, the sound is coming off of the instrument.
Always. Like, and it's funny, like, so it makes me think of a guy like Bill Frisell. Okay. Bill, if anybody here knows who Bill is one of the really like pioneers of using effects pedals with guitar in such an organic way. It's not like he can play so much guitar, but he can play the pedals like instruments as well. But if you see his setup, it's like bubblegum and band-aids, and like it's nothing about it is technical. And it's funny, I even took a picture of his pedal board because I wanted to steal some settings of his line 6 green, delay. It meant nothing. I don't know how to play like him. So playing into these pedals, like me, like my bad version of guitar, it sounds terrible. You need to be him to use his gear, and his gear is just like patched together, and like he doesn't know how it's getting recorded at all.
Conversely, when I was in my Paisley Park days, and this you'll appreciate, my Paisley Park days, we had a middle studio that was like Studio C, there was kind of like a closet that they turned into a control room, but the room was originally built as a rehearsal room for dancers. So it has like hard maple basketball court floors, mirrors on all sides, and they rented it out to Jeff Beck as a tour rehearsal space. Right. So it's Jeff Beck, and it's Terry Bozzio on drums, and the keyboard, the Banks, not Tony Banks, is that right? Kicking Moog bass.
Okay, Stanley Banks or
yes. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah.
So it's the three of them, and I'm like, oh my God, Beck is getting so many sounds out of his guitar, and I look over, and it's guitar, his hands, straight wire into the amp. Yeah, no pedals.
I have to say, I really avoided the gear thing early on as a player by being with Marcus, because what people don't know, and he's really into tech, he's deaf in one ear. I have 3 mentors, 2 of them only hear in mono, Marcus and my dad. They're both, and I always had a joke with them. They were deaf in the opposite ears. So I always wanted to get together with them and make a record in stereo. And anytime the 3 of us would get together, I'd stand in the middle and I'd position them this way. I'm like, you guys are finally hearing me. You finally get me. But, honestly, it was funny. I remember really early on, I'm going to mention Gene Paul again. And for folks who don't know who Gene Paul is the son of Les Paul. His mentor was Tommy Dowd. Tom Dowd was Tom Dowd. I don't need to explain who Tom Dowd was. And he was just the heaviest. The only engineer I know of that worked on the Manhattan Project, was drafted by the Brooklyn Dodgers, could play trombone, and invented recording engineer. He's a genius, a genius. Gene sat me down when I first got an MPC 3000, a sampler. It was the only piece of gear I had. I saved for months to get this thing. And he basically said to me, you're going to be tempted to buy all these synths and outboard effects and all these things. He said, do me a favor, take a year and only use this piece of gear. Only use this piece of gear, learn every single thing you need to know to make records and sample just with this. Then get another synth, then maybe get like a cheap effects unit. And I did this like in this sort of methodical way. Like I really learned how to use my MPC, and it made a huge difference. He said, I only learned how to use things one at a time and get the most out of the least you can. And that way, when you move forward, you know, it's just like I have a bass. I know bass players that have like 20 basses and they're like, well, this is my bass for ballads. And this is I'm like, this is my bass. This is my bass for ballads too. It's a bass, you know. It's important. It's important to really get the most out of what you're using. The least amount of gear with the most amount of results, I think is the best.
You've also answered a question for me, and that is how somebody does as much work and as deep a work as you do can manage to still have a happy marriage. And it's the answer. marry Colette the closer.
Yeah.
And don't have a lot of gear.
Well, and I don't. And I'll tell you another thing. I met my wife after my father passed away. We did a concert for him. Actually, this is kind of like a nice story.
That isn't when you, I mean, you met her when you
I met her as a child, but we reconnected as adults. We did a concert for my father with a bunch of the artists that he produced at Lincoln Center. They had an outdoor thing. Hal Willner and I produced a concert, which was effectively like his funeral. And my now wife, came to this concert, and I'll tell you something, like actually, and I'm really, really serious about this, or at least it was important. I met her. She had a young child. I became a stepfather because the father really wasn't in the picture as much. And part of the success of our marriage was like, no more touring. You know, I figured out like I'm going to work at home and actually raise this kid. And, you know, when you talk about gear and you talk about, I'm like, my thing was like, I want to raise this kid. I want to have balance. I want to have a little bit of it all. Like, I didn't want to just be like, you know, always on the road, always doing a gig. I have friends that live on the road and they have like kids and they never see their kids. I really thought it was important to change what I was working on. So kind of at the same time as I was raising my son Cole, like I just decided I'm going to be a film composer. I know nothing about how this works, but I want to make sure that I figure out a way to be at home and do these gigs and not have a crazy like environment in the house. Like, so honestly, the not having a lot of gear it's like it's my workspace is simple. Like it's not chaotic, you know?
Well, and I gotta drop props. I've dropped enough props for your work as an artist and producer and composer. But let us frame that Cole was the youth governor for the freaking state of California as well. So you kind of nailed that out of the park as well.
My son won an election, a statewide election, and was the governor of California. That's hysterical. And then when he won the governorship, I worked out a deal where I controlled all the water and mineral rights. So I made it work for me. I made it go in a circle. So it was great.
It was good. It was kind of like Joel. It was Adam Dorn's Chinatown.
Yeah, exactly. It was my version of like Sergeant Bilko. I was like, I got it. You know, my great scheme. But yeah, I just, you know, it was interesting. Like growing up with my father as a record producer. The one thing I didn't want to emulate was how much I didn't see him. Like he was a great dad and I loved him, but he was gone a lot. And that's a big deal. This business really draws you into things, and everything's a deadline and so important. Like, I sometimes think about some of the gigs I work on, and I just take a step back, and I'm not going to curse. I'll keep it clean, but I'm like, it's an effing sitcom. Like, I'm sorry, nobody's lives are getting.
Yeah, it's not, you're not curing cancer.
No, and that's funny. My wife, like when I first started working on the Richard Pryor documentary, I was so amped up, and she sat me down one day and she's like, "You're not curing cancer. I love Richard Pryor, but this film is going to get scored and you're going to do a great job, and you're not, calm down. It's just a film." And I'm like, she's right. It's just, somewhere someone is working on, developments in pancreatic cancer research, which are way more important than a film score that I'm doing. Like, I do look at it that way. But
Yeah,
whatever.
That's a great perspective. Hey,
Yeah.
we're a little bit over an hour into this so far, and we haven't taken any questions or had any interaction from the crowd at large.
Yeah.
So I want to start by thanking you very much for making yourself available. I know how crazy your schedule is, and how many deadlines you have going, and I really appreciate the solid that you've done for us in this section.
Yeah, man, my pleasure. And yeah, I'm open to answer anybody's questions about anything.
Cool. So the floor is open for questions.
Anybody?
Don had a question in the chat.
Okay.
Don Rutkoff, he says, they say, does the name Jerry Goldsmith resonate with you? Any Oscar nominations, one win.
Jerry Goldsmith is what I refer to as like, there's a generation where film scoring was like, I feel like it's changed so much now. There were, to not speak as much to Jerry's body of work, but to speak to how things have changed. One of the things about composing now that is kind of a disappointment to me is that so many composers right now are actually not trained like competent musicians, and it's stunning. Also, there are I did it over the winter, Jim. You'll love this. I was working on a film where a director was driving me nuts. And to calm myself down during the film, I would just write music as therapy, because I write all the time. So I started speaking to, and I'm sorry, I didn't, I love Jerry Goldsmith. I want to be clear about that. Like, he's like in that heavy, real, legends, category. So whatever. I just want to be clear about that. But I took a poll of 13 friends of mine that are composers. And the question was, do you write music when you don't have a gig? Only 1 out of 13 actually just writes music. And I can't, like, coming from a world where I'm like obsessed with Thelonious Monk and Duke Ellington and, Wayne Shorter. And I'm like, how can you not write? Like, I write music when I'm on a gig that's driving me nuts as therapy. like when I'm on an action film that's like falling apart and it's this like totally like mundane gig, I'm just like, I better write something to cheer myself up, And Jerry Goldsmith, that generation of guys, maybe a little bit further back, like the Elmer Bernstein and, the Bernard Herrmanns, and just, what's that? Mancini. I mean, you know what? A couple years ago, I did a gig for Disney. This will be related to how I think about Jerry Goldsmith and that generation of composers. I did a gig for Disney. I'm going to tell a story right now that is actually kind of funny. I walked into Disney. I got a call from a producer there. You walk in and they have you sign an NDA right away. So you don't even know why you're there, but you sign an NDA, like you can't talk about anything. So I'm like, I always just walk in and I'm like, okay, whatever, fine. Take me in a conference room. There's like an 80-inch television. We're all looking at this screen because it's about to tell me what I'm about to work on, because they take you through like a PowerPoint presentation. So I fainted because the logo that came up was the Star Wars logo. Oh, So Star Wars comes up, and I want everyone to listen very closely right now, because the following words came out of the head of Disney Music to me looking at the Star Wars logo, and I'm thinking like, I just bought a house. And he goes, we don't have a lot of money for this one.
Oh, shit.
I couldn't, but what they had was, I had to work with John Williams on a new version of the Cantina theme, the iconic Cantina theme from the very first Star Wars film. They built this installation in Anaheim that's like a $2 billion or $1.5 billion, you know, build out, and they built a cantina, and my version of the Cantina theme is the theme. And I had to send my jazzy big band stuff back and forth to John Williams. The notes I got were so life affirming. They were so musician and music affirming. Someone had been hired. The reason why they said we don't have a lot of money for this is they had paid a genius to fail, and then I get the call to be the fixer. So they, you know, so I got these lovely messages through emissaries from John Williams, like, I don't know who Adam is, but he clearly understands music and what I was trying. I'm like feigning that John Williams is like, you know, gets it. He's, and I didn't realize this, huge jazz fan, huge, like he was a jazz piano player. I didn't know any of this. I don't know all the history, you know, on these people, but yeah, that's pretty kick-ass. I was like, you know what?
That is probably the heaviest story you've ever told me.
Yeah, I'm like, what else do I need to? John Williams likes what I do. Goodbye. I'm gonna go into my next. I'm gonna run an olive oil company now or something.
Now you should send him a stack of your dad's old vinyl.
Yeah, he would.
Home.
He would love that. No, I actually got a note to him through. It's so funny to think of John Williams having an agent. Like, do you ever hear the story about Irving Berlin and did I tell you the story about Irving Berlin and Steven Spielberg? How Steven Spielberg wanted to use the song "Always" in the film "Always." It's an Irving Berlin song. I won't tell the full story because to tell it correctly, it's long. But effectively, Irving Berlin told Steven Spielberg, "You can't use the song "Always," the standard. You know, "I'll be loving you always." He never let him use it. And he was 101 years old, and finally, Steven Spielberg calls him. And he goes, listen, we've asked a million times, why won't you let me use the song for the film? Like, I'm an Oscar-winning director. Like, you know, I love the song. It's my mother's favorite song. And Irving Berlin at 101 years old goes, listen, kid, I got big plans for that song. You can't use it. I got big plans. Yeah. So I'm like, I don't care who you are. There is someone that's going to shut you down, you know, like some, you know. Anyway, I digress, but if I would love any other, I mean, I love the someone invoking Jerry Goldsmith is very cool, but if there's any other questions or thoughts or stories anyone wants to share.
You know, I have a question. Here's a question for you. I know your dad, like your dad's known as the producer of, you know, basically the most important jazz catalog of its era, the Atlantic Jazz Catalog.
Yeah.
But he also won Grammys for like Roberta Flack.
Yeah.
With jazz players. Like how, right? I mean, tell us about some of the cats that were on those records and kind of his way of thinking about it.
Well, okay. So Roberta came from playing in clubs in DC with like a little trio. So my dad's idea was, if we're going to make her first record, let's use Ron Carter and Grady Tate. And it's Ron Carter on electric bass, and he sounds amazing on it. I mean, Killing Me Softly, he sounds so yeah, it's so great. And I know that's not on the first record, but I'm just saying, like, he always used jazz musicians and like the certain kind of R&B-ish studio musicians on all the records. He just thought that they knew the language the best. They brought tons of ideas from their jazz background to pop things, because in jazz, everything is made up. So you want someone bringing ideas to a track, not just someone reading a chart and being verbatim. So he always leaned on, and I've actually always done the same thing. I mean, you know, maybe not with guys on that level, but
well, I mean, you've been making records with Charlie. I mean, tell us about some of the other, Charlie Hunter, who is, you know, one of the greatest guitar players of our time. It's can't discount that.
But no, I mean, but at the same time, like, you know, on my records, I think I had like David Fathead Newman, who was from Ray Charles band, and like,
Yeah.
I had, Marcus and Bill Frisell and Charlie and Steve Bernstein, and I'm trying to think who else. I just love leaning on jazz musicians because I think that jazz musicians don't have the same. They love being presented with a style of music that they're not normally featured on. They get to be creative in something that they don't usually do. Like, I'm presenting something that isn't like a standard jazz language. So it's like, great, I get to stretch out and I get to bring my creativity to a different style of music.
Well, and it's interesting because generally in a lot of the stuff you're doing, there's not like there's a blowing section in the middle of it, right?
Yeah.
And yet these guys, so the stretching out for them is adapting to the feel and the fit of the track rather than being able to play, play over crazy changes.
Yeah, it's not about, and it's funny, like I've worked with certain folks where they're just like, hey, you know what? You have such a clear concept of what you want. Here's 3 passes through the tune. Do whatever you want. Like when especially with older musicians where they're like, I have no idea what you want. Like working with Dr. John was hysterical because I worked on this like piece with Hal and I did this piece with the Kronos Quartet, and we had Mac, Dr. John's real name is Mac Rabanek. We had Mac play on it, and he was just like, I don't know what you want, but I'm just gonna play, and it was just like, he just played, and I go and do my editing thing because that's how, like, it's interesting when you're trained as a musician and you deal with samples, you understand tunings and harmony and chord structure and arranging. Like a lot of producers in this day and age sample something, they don't know what key it's in. They don't know when things are out of tune. It's really fun when you understand dense harmonic concepts and you start, overlapping samples with each other. But you're thinking in terms of like, well, what would Gil Evans do? And it becomes music. It's not just like, here's a sample and this is a beat and here's a synthesizer. There's a lot of intention, I guess. And I was trying to say that earlier. Like, there's a lot of intention. Charlie Hunter and I have something in common. We do something that's difficult and make it sound very easy. He plays an instrument that's 3 bass strings, 3 bass strings and 4 guitar strings. He sounds like 2 people at once. But when you hear him play, he's so good at it. He actually made the mistake of becoming so good at it that people are like, yeah, he's a guitar player. And I'm like, no, he's playing bass and guitar at the same time. And it's so well done that you're not even aware of that, So I try to do the same thing, like paint these pictures, these audio pictures that are really hyper pointillist kind of, minor details. And that makes it just sound like a fun thing,
Man, that's Steve. Well, and the other thing, when you've got a jazz background or some music theory chops, and you're comping solos from people who are playing wild, you will hear things differently.
Yeah.
With my limited knowledge, that got me a lot of you just hear things different. You can pick out when all of a sudden somebody's accidentally across 2 tracks put together something in, displaced pentatonics or something that makes sense to your brain.
Yeah. And it actually, you can do comping stuff where you don't make it sound like that's impossible to do on a tenor saxophone. You actually know the limits of the instrument, how to build something, and also how to make someone sound like, even if they didn't play it, I end up getting, folks saying, the horn players come back to me and they're like, man, I wish I played that. Like, that's a really, you know what I mean? Like, you know what you want from that instrument. So you know how to write and comp for it,
Absolutely.
Probably better than humans, to be honest. I'm not very good at comping vocals. I'm bad with breaths and all that.
Man, so back to the floor. I'm looking at the chat. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I see Bob Smith had a couple of nice comments. Earlier he mentioned talking about your gear, not boring, very pragmatic to be productive with minimal setups.
Oh,
So
cool.
true. And then he also said, perspective. You may think musical entertainment is a lower priority than medical research, but as someone who spent 50 years in cardiac arrest medical research, I can safely state researchers also need a break from serious endeavors. Musical entertainment is huge for such stress relief. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, that's great. Now I just have to make some music that's like good for getting an MRI too. Yeah, music.
Let me give you a hint. It sounds like craft work at the beginning.
It's so funny. The first time I got an MRI, I wanted to call like Steve Reich, or like it was
Yes,
like,
exactly.
holy, it was
MRI
like,
phase.
yeah. It was like kind of crazy, but that's beautiful. I mean, the whole thing is, it is all connected, and it's funny. Like, I was at my dentist's office the other day, and he was talking about how like music in his practice is so important. He needs certain music to be on to focus, a certain way. And I get it. I agree. I agree 100%.
A question just came in on the chat about your experience recording, and this is going to go to your engineer days, recording larger acoustic ensembles like orchestras, and if you have any go-to techniques for that, or is that something, if you're confronted with, you're like calling the orchestra guy?
So I am very respectful of, or mindful of, when there is someone better available to do a thing. Generally, if I'm at the stage where an orchestra is being recorded, or I'm recording an ensemble for a film score, I go into record producer mode. I want to run the session, but I want to make sure the right engineer is there. Like, I don't take on tasks just because I know how to do them. I like to build a team that I trust to take care of responsibilities, so I can never lose sight of the bigger picture. So I honestly, I go out of my way to take engineering and technical stuff off of my to-do list, because I find that it takes me away from focusing on the actual music a lot of the times. So I wish I had if I'm recording a big band, like, I have a couple of engineers that I love working with, and they take that weight.
Drop names.
Well, okay. So funny enough, well, no, he's retired. Joe he won't work anymore. He's done.
Wow.
Younger guys. My buddy Mario McNulty here in the city, he was Bowie's guy for years under Visconti. My buddy Mario, I'm just like, Mario, take the board. Like, I got musicians to talk to. I got a session to run. I got charts to make sure that they're done correctly. Like, I kind of really, maybe it's good as what I do, speaking to a room full of people in the technical and the engineering side of things. I lean on you guys in those situations more than myself, because chances are I've written the music. I've probably played a lot of the instruments on the music that's already at the session to begin with. And now when it's time to capture that next level of, larger ensemble, or maybe a chamber orchestra, I have a thing when I see composers conducting on Instagram, and they make pretend that they can conduct. I think it's one of the most insulting things in my line of work. Conducting is the hardest thing to do. Don't pretend you know how to do it. I hate that. It gets me so angry. So it's the same thing. I let the pros step in when when we're on a level where their teams can be built. I'm a big fan of letting others do the work that they do better than me.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want my dentist doing my orthopedic surgery.
Exactly. If I conducted, everything would sound like Ornette Coleman. Like, it would be the worst conducting in the world. And I work with this director. We're getting ready to do this action film in a couple months, and he has like an orchestral thing set up, and he's like, all he wants to do is take a picture with the baton, and I'm like, have at it, but you have no idea how insulting that is. That's like, I'm trying to, it's like some weird theater, you know what I mean?
It's like the solo record from the trust fund kid.
Yeah. And I've made those, and they're not.
I think we all
I've
have.
made those, and I've made those with like Steve Ferroni and Larry Goldings and me, and it's like a billionaire writing a song for his fiance. Like, it's amazing what the recording industry has turned into.
And singing it themselves,
Yeah.
of course. There's a question from Don Rudkoff on the floor, wondering if you've ever worked with Buster Poindexter, aka David Johansen.
I have with Hal. I've worked with David a couple times with Hal. We did a couple live shows at Royce Hall in Los Angeles as part of a project for the Harry Smith archives. Harry Smith was folk music. I'm trying to think of, the Smithsonian has his archives, field recordings, and he was an animator. So we did some stuff with David. I did a bunch of stuff with David with Hal, never on my own, but David's great. David is amazing. Very, very fun guy to hang out with and work with. Yeah.
No, that's a freaking super fun thing. I just want to, as we close out tonight, and again, thank you so much for your time. I want to drop one last thought about Hal, because I only knew Hal a little bit. I'd met Hal Willner a few times over the years, but Hal had this thing that he did, and I know you're going to want to talk about it a little bit, where I could call him if I was running into a problem on a record, and he'd be like, here's what you do.
Yeah.
Here's the fix. And it could be like a interpersonal thing between two players, or it could be just like something's kind of just not feeling right. What would you do? You got one of those stories for us?
I have too many, actually. My favorite two are, I was working on a David Sanborn record with Hal when he was going through, he was starting to head into having to sober up. He was in a bad state of his drug use. And I made the mistake of thinking, well, because he's not paying attention. He would fall asleep and be snoring while we were mixing. And 30 minutes would go by, and he would wake up, and he would have the perfect, like, I'm just trying to, I don't remember the tune. I think we did a suite of Bernard Herrmann film music, and like, it was like 11 minutes long or something. It's on a record called Another Hand. And he just woke up and, like, out of nowhere was like, we don't need the bridge. Like, he was just like, literally, like, it was like one of these things where he was like, literally like, let's make an edit. We need to get rid of this section. And he was 100% right. And it was like, you don't think he's paying attention at all. He and my father did the same thing. My father would zone out. My father wasn't a musician. Hal wasn't a musician. They just had this sense of what was right in a recording, what was right in a mix. They weren't trained in the classical sense of being able to speak in terms of frequencies or even musical notes, or, like harmony or theory or any kind of stuff. But we were working with Laurie Anderson on a record called Life on a String, and Hal was sitting next to me. And I remember Laurie did this thing. We would work on a song for like 9 hours or 10 hours in a day. And everyone would be real excited, and we would go home. We'd come back in the next day, and that night she would have erased it. She would just like,
oh, good God.
Very mercurial. Yeah, and that's fine. It's fine. I have a bunch of rough mixes where I'm like, this could have easily been released. It sounds great. They were working on something, and she was doing this over and over and over again. And I just watched him pull some Obi-Wan Kenobi stuff with her, and something that had taken like 3 months, he finally just figured out like the pathway in. He was just like, like, it was as simple as like, make the intro the chorus or whatever. It was like one of those things. He was just so great at changing the course of a session and solving problems. He solved problems so well. I mean, I wish I had more of like a concrete, this is like,
but that's a
20 years
super
ago.
Concrete. Erasing the real is actually kind of pretty concrete too.
Yeah, I mean, just like, hey, this doesn't work. And you think he's sound asleep, and he just gets up and he goes, yeah, that's wrong. You know, and you go, whoa, you know, 3 weeks later, you know, just really, he just always like, he just understood what he was doing so well. There was no fear, there was no anxiety, there was no hesitation. So much, very confident, very kind, very, very. When we worked with Brian Eno, it was like the two of them, it could not have been more fun in terms of creativity. It was so respectful. Like Brian Eno was like everything you want to think he is, he was. It was just like so democratic, so open to ideas and exploring. It's just so damn important on any gig, you know. But Hal, when we worked with Kesha, Hal did this tribute record to Mark Bolan. It was the last record he ever made, and Kesha was the vocalist on Children of the Revolution, and he was just like, I'm too old. You got to stand there with her and keep her calm in the studio. He was like, I can't produce an artist like this. He's like, I know she's like a baby. And I was like, okay. So I stood in the room with her and like, you know, this concept of vocal producer cracks me up, because I'm like, a producer's a producer, like a vocal producer. Give me a break. But I guess I was the vocal producer because I dealt with the nervous artist for Hal. But he was smart enough. He was like, no, go in. She'll love you. You know, you'll make her laugh. And it was fun. But he knew his stuff. He really knew his stuff.
Well, thank you again for a wonderful hour and a half. And I want to thank the members of the PNW AES for giving us this opportunity. I would encourage all of you to check out Adam's latest record, Boombox, which is, in the words of my pal David Bridie, is a cracker of a record.
Yeah, I ate some crackers while I made the record.
I bet you did. I bet you did. And Adam, once again, thanks so much for making time with us in this section. We hope you come back soon.
Oh, my pleasure. This was so much fun. And next time we'll talk about our dogs.
You've got it.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, from Immersion Network's headquarters in Redmond, Washington. Have a great night.
Be good. Thanks.
All right. So thank you, Adam and Jim. That was wonderful.
All right. I'm going to head out because it's way past my bedtime.
Okay. Sleep tight.
Good night, Lula, and send my love to Colette.
I will do that, Jim. You take care.
Bye, Leo.